we're going to get started. So as I mentioned, I'm Kathleen. I work in community relations at King's University, and community relations has the pleasure of working with our alumni, with our parents of current students, and also with our churches. And we have quite a collection of churches that partner alongside of us to support our different ministries at the King's University. This is a new series, a new initiative actually, doing these public lectures. And with COVID, we're looking for unique ways to connect with our community. And it might not be so unique, you might all be zoomed out, but you are here now and we're happy to have you. Community Relations has been co-hosting this three-part series on justice with our MICA Center. And I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan Nikolai de Koning, who's the director of the MICA Center, to hear a little bit about what they do. And this is the last of our justice series, something about maybe wrapping up our justice series as well. So Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen, and greetings, everybody. On behalf of the MICA Center, I see lots of familiar faces, friends of King's and friends of Michael and of mine and family. And so it's really wonderful to see all of you, or at the very least to see your names. And yeah, a brief word about the MICA Center. So the MICA Center is King's on-campus initiative to create space for students and faculty and the wider community to learn about and to be empowered to take action on issues of justice and peacemaking and anti-poverty. And we do that in a number of ways. We have a variety of courses that students can take at King's, experiential learning opportunities, service learning opportunities in places like Bangladesh and Honduras and elsewhere. And we also host occasional events like this, where we bring in a voice of wisdom, like Michael's, to share about a key issue of justice and discipleship. And yeah, so we're really looking forward to what Michael will bring this evening. And we've had a few events over the last few weeks. Last week, Ida Mutoigo and Roy Birkenbosch walked us through how the pandemic has affected those who are living in poverty around the world. And 3 weeks ago, Dr. Doug Herring, who teaches theology at King's, walked us through the language of justice in the book of Romans. And both of those lectures are available. They were recorded and they're available online on YouTube. And maybe Ashley, when she introduces Michael, can let folks know how to find that. But yeah, so we're really grateful that you're joining us. And if you want to learn more about the MICA Center, you can go to King's website to do that. And I'll turn things over to Ashley, who works with Kathleen in our community engagement office, and she'll introduce Michael.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. So I'll start with, if you were to go to youtube.com and if you were to put the King's University, and it does need Edmonton in there in order to find the right page for the King's University here, there is now a playlist on there called Lectures. And actually, as the time goes on, before we head and end our time together tonight, I'll put a link to that in the chat, if that's an easy way. So we're trying to make it within a week or so. The lecture that you'll see and hear tonight will be uploaded and available online if you would like to share it or go back for any information. So I have the privilege this evening of introducing Dr. Micheal DeMoo. And as I look around to many of the names and faces here on the screen, perhaps he is not a new person to you, but for those who are may just be coming to know who he is an associate professor of social philosophy and politics, history, and economics. He has been at King's since 2009 and teaches courses on human rights, markets, and society, the history of political thought, democracy, and war and peace. His research currently focuses on how different conceptions of human rationality do and should shape how we make and justify public policy. And in his spare time, such as it is, he enjoys birding, hiking, and arguing with people about hockey. So without further ado, Michael, I pass this off to you.
Thank you. If people would prefer, we could just argue about hockey rather than giving the lecture, but I suppose I prepared something today, so I should say something. Thanks for being here, folks. I'm going to share my screen here because you don't want to just look at my face most of the time. I've got pictures to show you. So my talk, as you, come on, show it, there we go. I call it John A. Severed Head and the Politics of Public Memory. In August, in late August, most of you will have noticed in the news in Montreal, a statue of John A. Macdonald that had been around for a little over a century was torn down by protesters. His head came loose in the process. And there was much uproar, wringing of hands, and public discussion. One of the voices to be heard, unsurprisingly, was Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney, whose reaction on Twitter was this: "A mob has torn down and defaced the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald in Montreal. This vandalism of our history and heroes must stop. If the city of Montreal decides not to restore Wade's statue of Macdonald to where it had stood for 125 years, we would be happy to receive it for installation on the grounds of the Alberta legislature." This was not the first time that John A. Macdonald had, or his statues had suffered what many considered an indignity. The picture on the left here is a statue of Macdonald in Charlottetown that was painted red, also, I believe in June. The red, I believe, is to denote blood. And the picture on the right is the same statue in Montreal that was spray painted red in 2018. Nor, of course, are these incidents confined to Canada or to John A. Macdonald. On the left here, you'll see a picture. This was also widely remarked and noticed from June of this year. The statue in Bristol of John Colston, who was widely remembered in Bristol as a public benefactor, but also had made his fortune in the slave trade. His statue was torn down and dumped in the harbor, where I believe it remains. Also in June, in the picture on the right is a statue of Christopher Columbus in St. Paul, Minnesota, that was brought down. In June as well, a lot of this happened over the summer, in London, England, there were Black Lives Matter protests, and a statue here of Winston Churchill was not torn down, but as you can see, it was edited, shall we say, right? With Churchill was a racist, and with Black Lives Matter wrapped around his legs. This, of course, got a response from the sorts of people you would very likely expect a response from, in this case from the Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, who said it's absurd and shameful that this national monument should today be at risk of attack by violent protesters. Yes, he sometimes expressed opinions that were and are unacceptable to us today, but he was a hero, and he fully deserves his memorial. We cannot now try to edit or censor our past. We cannot pretend to have a different history. And it's not just statues, of course. It's also names that are controversial, and some of these are high profile and some of these are slightly more mundane, perhaps. Local to us here in Edmonton is the question of the status of the name of the Oliver neighborhood, named after Frank Oliver, who was a municipal politician and journalist, and who also played a significant role in pushing to have Indigenous communities displaced from lands in what is now central Edmonton. And the Oliver Community League itself has petitioned the city to change the name of the neighborhood from Oliver to something else. Similarly, just in the past week or so, the law school at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, decided to change the name of one of its major halls from Sir John A. Macdonald Hall. Every time these things occur, there's much discussion, which, as public discussion tends to do, generates often more heat than light. I'm going to try not to generate too much heat, maybe cast a little bit of light, but more I want to give context. So the big question that we face in these kind of cases is what's going on? We've already seen in the quotes from Kenny and Johnson, one way of framing what's going on. So Kenny sees the toppling of the statue of John A. Macdonald as vandalism of our history and heroes. Johnson sees the defacement, if you will, of the Churchill statue as an attempt to edit and censor our past. But these raise questions when we look at this, right? I've highlighted these words for a reason here. Who is the our in our history? And who are our heroes? Which past is our past? Whose past, right? What we see when we see these acts of iconoclasm, if you will, is contestation about who we are and how we remember our past. What the attacks are on, allegedly, is not so much statues or works of art, but on a certain account of us, the political community, and its past, its story. That's what's really going on. This contestation that's acted out symbolically to a large extent. The pulling down of statues doesn't change any policy. The erecting of statue doesn't change policy. But it has crucial symbolic weight, and these symbols matter. So what I want to dig into a little bit is how and why do these symbols matter? What's the contestation? And then are there better and worse ways to contest this? The important thing to understand when we look at public memorials is the connection of memory, identity, and power. Public memorials aren't, in spite of some of the rhetoric, history lessons. They're not just historical artifacts. They're set up in order to shape our sense of who we are, that is our identity, our collective identity, and to legitimize a certain distribution of power by reference to a particular narrative. In other words, they tell stories, or they're like illustrations in a storybook, in a public storybook that we walk around in when we walk around in public spaces. And that narrative says something about who we are. It's a narrative that we're asked to accept and endorse and find ourselves in. It's also a narrative that justifies a certain distribution of power, that says, this is the way things are and they ought to be. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. These are the reasons we have what we do and why others do not have what they do not have. Right? In particular, most of these memorials that we're looking at tell a kind of narrative that can be understood to be a national mythology. So a national mythology is, it doesn't necessarily imply, as the word myth is sometimes taken to, a falsehood, but a big story, a big encompassing story that deals with identity, and in particular national identity. What a national mythology asks us to do is to identify ourselves with the nation. That when we say us, or we, or ours, to mean we, a political community, a nation. So John A. Macdonald, as a namesake of a school or a central figure in our parks, is asking us to recognize him as somehow a cornerstone of us and our identity and our collective identity and our identification with a nation. So not with other communities, not families, churches, social clubs, things like that, but the nation as a central pillar in our identity. National mythologies also pull out heroes and villains. They tell us who to admire, who to emulate, and who is wicked and to be avoided. It focuses, a national mythology will focus on particular moments as crystallization points, as things within which we should find ourselves identified and emerging. So on the right, you see the Vimy Memorial. One of the great stories told about Canadian nationhood was that the Battle of Vimy Ridge was when Canada became a nation. We gained independence in 1867, but we really became a people in the military struggle at Vimy Ridge, right? And we have a monument to symbolize that. So it asks us to focus on particular moments or watershed stories, and again, to find ourselves in and to identify ourselves. They also can become focus of national rituals. They function almost like icons. So at the Vimy Memorial every Remembrance Day, there's ritual around it, around various other kinds of national symbols. You can gather and you can go through what are sort of quasi-religious, but ultimately national rituals in order to solidify our sense of identity as, in this case, Canadians, or in other cases here as Britons or something like that. So now those are the sort of functions of national mythology. National mythologies aren't something new. In fact, they're recognizable in the Bible. And I want to talk just briefly about, as it were, the national mythology in the Bible, because I want to come back to that again later when I try to say some things about how I would like our story to be told. If you read the Old Testament, particularly the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and into Judges, you have what is essentially the national mythology of the people of Israel, their founding story. And here, their founding story is imparted to them largely by God. And they're told who they are in order so that they can know how to live. So a repeated refrain throughout the books of the law. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command before you. In this case, it's Deuteronomy 5:15, which was a command to liberate slaves. But if you read throughout the Pentateuch, all the way, the repeated refrain over and over and over again. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Remember, the Lord redeemed you. You have a similar national mythology making to some degree at the very beginning of the book of Joshua. The people of Israel are allowed to enter the promised land. And when they do so, one of the first acts of this new nation is to set up a memorial. So Joshua takes 12 stones from the River Jordan, upon which the priests had carried the Ark of the Covenant across the river on dry land, and he set these stones up, right? And they are there, Joshua 4:9 tells us, to this day. They've become a part of the symbolic role. They're there as constant reminders of who Israel is and where they came from. In a slightly darker way, the end of the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 25, enjoins this new nation to remember the harms done to it. Remember what Amalek did to you. So the Amalekites had ambushed the people of Israel while they were in the desert. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey out of Egypt. Therefore you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget, it says. The key in the national mythology of Israel, particularly in this constant refrain, remember you were slaves in the land of Egypt and the Lord redeemed you and led you here and gave you this land. It prefaces a law that is there to tell the people of Israel that they're not to set up a new state that is a facsimile of the states that they were liberated from. They're to live differently in this land from how the Egyptians lived or the other empires around them. They're consistently reminded of this because the law is a law to establish a peculiar people, a people who don't do things the way things were habitually done. So this is a national myth. That doesn't mean it's false. I believe it's true, right? But it's a big story about who Israel is that asks them to engage in acts of remembrance so that they know who they are and so that they can behave accordingly. You were once slaves and you are now free. In many ways, this comes back in the Minor Prophets and stuff, but I'm not a biblical scholar and I'm not going to go over that. Got a place I want to go. We can always discuss it later, right? But one of the things in the Minor Prophets is saying to the people of Israel, you forgot who you were, and you started living like the nations around you. Right? But the key thing is remembering for Israel means living differently. Our own national myths in Canada are contested. I want to talk quickly about two forms of contestation in our national mythology, and then focus on one that I think is most apt. In many ways, in Canada's national mythology, you have partisan contestation. So people representing different parties or different political cultures within Canada want to tell our story differently. So when you have a conservative government and they invest in heritage things, they want us to do things and to remember Canada's story in ways that connect it closely with like the War of 1812 or the Battle of Vimy Ridge, that wrap it around Canada's military history and a sort of a history of unified struggle. Whereas when liberals get a say over our national mythology, they want to tell stories about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as a watershed and as not simply an important device of law, but as a crucial articulation of Canada's essential identity, as what holds us together. Canada, unlike the US, doesn't have a strong founding fathers story. The United States, the American national mythology has an important place for these sort of semi-divine heroes of the founding fathers, but when conservatives are in power, they kind of want that. And you can see them kind of push it, even in terms of the kind of curriculum that they often kind of encourage. That's one kind of partisan contestation. That usually one kind of contestation, right? I'll call that partisan contestation. Those battles are really important to the people involved, but they don't usually involve toppling statues. They usually involve how heritage money is spent, how about what kind of events the national government puts on, how national curricula are designed. The ones that kind of lead in Canada to toppling John A. Macdonald is anti-colonial contestation. Anti-colonial contestation is based on a difference about what Canada's identity and history means. So for anti-colonialists, the story of Canada's founding and expansion, for which John A. Macdonald was both a crucial historical instigator, as is doubtless true, but also a crucial symbol of this. Canada's founding and expansion, rather than just being the story of nation building, of a sort of glorious bootstrapping nation building, is really the story of oppression, dispossession, and genocide of Indigenous peoples, enslaved peoples, Black Canadians, and so on. Right? That Canada's story is really one of settler colonialism, which is much less glorious than we like to imagine. For those with longer memories, in order to see this kind of difference, I invite you to go back into your record collection and pull out Gordon Lightfoot's famous Canadian Railroad trilogy and listen to it carefully and ask yourself, how would that go over today? Right? That's very much, right? That's a national mythology that he's articulating there, but it's one in which Indigenous people are almost entirely invisible, where the green dark forest was too silent to be real. I was tempted to actually make you listen to the song and so on. If this was a class, I'd listen to the song and make you discuss what you heard and so on, but we don't have time for that. But I encourage you to go back. The anti-colonial contestation says that story is not just partial, it's false and dangerous and hurtful, right? In fact, it's genocidal, right? That it's a story that justified, remember, these national mythologies legitimize a certain distribution of power, that legitimize the dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples, right? And therefore, the symbols that reinforce that narrative are not just offensive, they're dangerous, because that dispossession and genocide is ongoing. It's not something that just happened in the past and that we either regret or don't attend to, but it's an ongoing one. But that's a contested story too, right? So you have a number of contested stories about Canada's national mythology. The important thing to understand is this contestation is always present. In the rhetoric of people like Kenny or Johnson, there's a bit of a suggestion that, sorry, I just had to make sure that no one was telling me that they couldn't hear me. there's a bit of a suggestion that we were all fine and we all agreed on this story, and that everything was peaceful and good, and we all respected and loved our John A. Macdonald or our Winston Churchill until just recently. But this kind of contestation has always been present. It's just in many cases, people did not have the power to express it. One of the dangers of public monuments is that public monuments present the story that they tell, the national myth that they tell, as if it's the only story there is. They are often mute about the ways that they tell a story. They seem to not be asserting a story at all, but the story, the only one, right? The only and obvious one, the one in which Canada, in the case of, say, John A. Macdonald, in which Canada was this plucky young nation forged with by the uniting of disparate people who formerly couldn't get along, but now will engage in this beautiful national nation-building project by building a railroad from coast to coast. Well, that story was always contested, but when we see John A. Macdonald looking noble up on a plinth very high, the statue in Montreal that was brought down was up on a plinth surrounded by neoclassical colonnades, that presents that story as the only story. So these monuments generally don't very well represent that the story they're telling is contested. So they're mute about that contestation. But it's important for us to see that they are always, right from the beginning, acts of contestation themselves. The people who put up memorials are making a move in, as it were, a game of contestation for people's allegiance to a certain national story. They're fighting for one story as opposed to another, and they're trying to assert it, and in doing so also to legitimize a certain constellation of power, right? A certain arrangement of who has power. So memorials are expressions of contestation. They're not just things that we contest about, but they are themselves expressions of arguments and differences that were already present and that motivated their being set up. So they make contested claims about an ongoing contestation about the identity and distribution of power. A great example of this are Confederate memorials. The vast majority in the United States, the vast majority of these Confederate memorials that are so rightly controversial now were actually set up in the late 1800s and early 1900s in order to assert a certain Southern identity as reaction against the attempts at Reconstruction after the Civil War. They're not simply memorials to the dead. They're very political statements, and they're asserting who we are, right? Southerners are, the South is essentially white, and a certain distribution of power whereby white people are supreme and black people and other people of color are subservient, right? So they're not merely mute. They're telling a certain story in already a contestation. The, come on. Oh, sorry. I wanted to switch the slide. There we go. British historian David Olusoga said it quite nicely in response to the Colston statue following. He said, whatever is said over the next few days after the Colston statue came down, this was not an attack on history. The pulling down of the monument was not an attack on history. This is history. The setting up of the Colston statue is history, and it's being pulled down as history. And it's one of those historic moments whose arrival means things can never go back to how they were. Something's happening, and they're equally events, right? The national mythology is presented as if it exists outside of history and outside of the contestation about history and its meaning, but it's already inside of it. So responses to them are also part of history. Okay, where does this leave us? One of the things I'm a scholar of, insofar as I'm any kind of a scholar, is about democracy and about contestation in democracy. Disagreement and contestation, even heated contestation, is an inevitable and healthy part of a democracy. Democracies work well when we disagree even when we disagree vociferously, and when those disagreements are expressed and even expressed heatedly. That's healthy. That's good in a democracy. A democracy should not be such a unified polity where we all simply agree without demurral to a single national mythology. But the fundamental question in terms of democracy and whether democracies are healthy or unhealthy, whether stable or unstable, has to do with how we contest those differences. So one style of contestation is, as it were, a politics of provocation and counter-provocation, where we express and act on our differences by, to use modern lingo, triggering the libs or triggering the cons or something like that, by trying to piss each other off, essentially, right? Where you try to solidify a position, you try to mobilize people for your side by acts of provocation and counter-provocation. To a certain extent, that's what we see when we see statues torn down, and equally so in the responses. So I want to say Kenny's response, even though it was verbal, was as much a provocation as the tearing down of the statue, to say, I don't care that this statue represents something that you find not just objectionable or false, but positively dangerous. I don't care. I'm going to set it up, not just anywhere, but here in Alberta's, in the grounds of Alberta's legislature. That's a provocation. It's going for a response. It's not a serious policy proposal. It's a provocation. So the pulling down of statues is provocative, deliberately so. So are often the responses. They're provocative. But we don't have to do politics that way, or that's certainly not the only way of doing politics. We can also do politics by trying to seek mutual understanding and accommodation. That doesn't mean we cease to contest these things. It doesn't even mean that we don't contest them heatedly or passionately, but that we do it in ways that invite or at least make possible understanding each other. Politics of provocation and counter-provocation don't do much good in terms of helping people to actually understand what motivates the other side, right? About what vision of the good or what narrative they subscribe to, or what are their reasons for disagreeing with or contesting the narrative that is symbolized in the thing that has been torn down or that's been proposed to set up. Whereas it's possible, depending on how we frame things and do things, that we can contest things and yet also do it in a way that invites us to understand one another. In the process of doing these things, and that's what I want to pick up in a minute, we revisit and revise the national mythology. It's important to understand that these national stories are not static. They're constantly evolving, and we're constantly revisiting and revising it. And that's a good thing, because we learn new things, our identities change and evolve, the we changes, right? The Canadian we, as it were, that set up the statue of John A. Macdonald is not the same as the Canadian we of the 1960s, in which Gordon Lightfoot made sure he gave a shout out to Asian workers on the railways, and that's certainly not the same as the Canadian we of 2020. That changes. In the process of all this, I want to remind you that biblical suggestion that remembering well means living differently. Anyway, what I'm going to do now, hopefully without taking too long, is to make some suggestions about how we might be able to go about doing the politics of contestation over our national memory, our national mythology, if you will, hopefully in ways that invite or at least facilitate a politics of mutual understanding. That's what I want to try to suggest. Here's three things. They're connected, but they're not necessarily so. The one thing is, I would love to see the mayor of Edmonton, or name your leader of any particular polity, to commission, and I would like the mayor of Edmonton to hire fourth-year King's History students to do this. They would be more than able and good at doing this, to actually create an online public resource of historical memorials and place names. So I'll take Edmonton as an example, right? To spend a time finding out what have we got that in this city that memorializes things and names them, create a database online that allows people to find out what these mean. I was struck in a conversation that I had on Twitter about street names in Toronto, that I'd lived nearby Dundas Street and taken the Dundas streetcar for years on end, and it never occurred to me to wonder who Dundas was or what he meant. Well, I think we should make that easy, and that can provide links to differing narratives about who these people were or these events were that we're remembering, right? To put in some work, do a public resource that at least gives the opportunity for when we're going to argue about, and we surely will argue about place names. The Oliver neighborhood's already being argued about. Our City Hall is in Winston Churchill Square, right? That's going to be contested. It already is, no doubt, right? But there's going to be contestation about whether we should keep calling that Winston Churchill Square. Let's give the public a chance to be informed. If we can't be meaningfully informed, then we fall back on our assumed stories, the ones that are easy and intuitive to us because it's what we grew up with, or what we've been told by our side or our party or something like that. So you create a public resource. This wouldn't take a huge investment of public dollars. It would take some. I know there's not a huge amount of that lying around, but that's one way to go about it. You could build on that, and this is my next suggestion, is to convene a deliberative assembly. There's a huge literature on these, and I'm not going to get into it unless you guys want to talk about it in the questions, but theorists of what's called deliberative democracy have put a lot of work into thinking about and creating opportunities for citizens to get together and actually discuss with each other important issues. In many cases, it's representative citizens. So if you get together a representative body of citizens, making sure that it's as representative as meaningfully possible of meaningful stakeholders. In particular, I think with place names in Edmonton, Indigenous communities would be key, and their participation in this would be key to making it possible and workable, would be to get citizens together, give them the material, time, and resources they need and facilitation that they need, and have them talk about not just this name controversy or that one, but about how we should approach historical naming and memorialization in general. What should we have? What should we not have? On what basis should we change names, and what basis should we retain them? These kinds of things are possible. They take work and facilitation, but they're not ridiculously difficult with some initiative and leadership. If that can be done, and a body like that could come up with a set of principles and criteria for public memorialization, when it's appropriate and when it's not, how to do it, how often we should change it, should we ever change it, and so on. If they could arrive at something like a shared framework, then you have a shared framework by which a body like City Council can adjudicate the particular disputes. So when there's pressure to change the name of Winston Churchill Square, as there surely will be, and to take a statue down, that you have some relatively commonly agreed upon legitimate criteria. Even if it doesn't work perfectly and you can't agreed upon material, you have citizens engaged in the process of trying to understand each other. And if you facilitate these properly, it can happen, rather than just engage in politics of provocation and counter-provocation and shouting it about each other on social media. Finally, I would love responsible bodies, and this could be such a deliberative assembly, to explore some creative possibilities for public memorials that can express and facilitate rather than cover over the contestation about our national mythology, or in the case of, say, Edmonton, our civic mythology. Remember that I said one of the problems with a lot of monuments is that they seem to suggest that the story they tell is the only story there is, as if it's taken for granted and unimpeachable, if you will. Memorials don't have to speak like that. And I'm going to show some examples of how that can be done, that allow where the contestation, that is a healthy and proper part of our democracy, can actually be present in the memorials themselves. So we don't have to fight over the memorials. We can actually, the memorials can facilitate some degree of healthy contestation. So I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to apologize, the pictures aren't great, got them off the internet. I wasn't able to scrape together any research money to go take all these pictures myself. One way is if we have memorials, you can have counter memorials. These are two statues that are, I wish I had a picture that allowed you to see how close these were together, in Hamburg, Germany. The one on the left is a Nazi era memorial to the German soldiers who died in the First World War. It portrays these German soldiers as clean, orderly, dignified. The style is very much sort of a mixture of neoclassical and a sort of a German, well, German granite solidity. It's very much the aesthetic of it is, in a sense, very Nazi, right? It's the kind of thing Albert Speer would have incorporated into his grand building designs. In the wake of the Second World War, there was much discussion about whether or not this, as long with other Nazi era memorials, should simply be destroyed. And the decision that was come to, after a long decision, was that rather than destroy it, nearby to put up a counter memorial. So the picture on the right here, you can see it's a sort of twisted form. You have torso, right? It's of death, is a memorial to the victims of Nazism, right? It was set up in the 1970s. And it's nearby, so that people encountering the one can't help but encounter the other. And so you have manifest in that same place this assertion and counter-assertion, this contestation over the meaning of the war, of Germany's place in history. So that's one possible way of doing these things. You can leave up your John A. Macdonald memorials, but that you place counter memorials to recognize that the nation building process that John A. Macdonald was not just a bit player in, the nation building process, was at the same time an act of genocide, right? And have them both asserted there. And they can, in a sense, artistically interact within a shared space. Another way of doing it is recontextualizing memorials. You don't pull them down as such, but you move them in a way that changes their meaning, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly. So the picture on the left is a statue. It's quite high. You don't get the great sense of scale here, of Joseph Stalin, that used to stand in Vilnius in Ukraine, in the center of town, if I remember correctly. Or sorry, not in Lithuania, not Ukraine. In Lithuania, it used to stand in the center of town. After the fall of the communist bloc, it was taken down along with a lot of other Soviet memorials. But then rather than simply being destroyed or scrapped, it was set up in a park that sort of set off and where it's sort of allowed it to sort of blend into the landscape. So Stalin doesn't disappear because Stalin was a crucial part of the history of Lithuania, right? Stalin and Stalinism. But where it's allowed to, as it were, fade, to fade into the landscape. It's not the center of town anymore. It's in the side park in the trees. That carries a different meaning, right? The memory is still there, but then by being recontextualized, the memory is. On the right are statues of British kings and so on at the Imperial Durbar near Delhi. So this was a massive open air theater where these Imperial Durbars, which were massive meetings during the British Raj, where British royalty and or their representatives sort of, okay, this is, real historians will get mad at me for saying this, received homage from the, and a recognition of their imperial overlordship from the assembled masses of the Indian nobility. But after independence, it became a place where statues that were erected of British kings and vice regents and so on and so forth throughout India were relocated and allowed to just sit there and weather. Right? You can see they don't mow the lawn, they don't keep it up, they're allowed in a similar way with the Stalin statue to weather and stay there. You're not erasing history, you're not getting rid of it, but by recontextualizing it, you're saying something very powerful about the role of the Indian Raj in the coming in the creation of modern India. So recontextualizing is another possibility. One hunch that I have, well, okay, I'll leave that this. Another way is that we'll make our memorials interactive. Make them things that people can interact with. Memorials don't tell a single story as if it's the only story. In other words, they don't cover up contestation so much when people are able to actually meaningfully interact with them. Here's two nice versions of that interaction to some degree. On the left, you have a part of the famous Five statue in Ottawa. So the famous Five, as you darn well should all know, were 5 women who were parties to the Persons case in the 1920s in Canada that ended up with a Supreme Court decision that women were persons and were thus allowed to be senators, amongst many other things, right? But the memorial to them in Ottawa is not set up on a plinth to simply be admired from afar, but they're set up in almost a plaza with actually chairs and stuff where people can interact with them. And sometimes that interaction is nice. Here's a little girl pointing at the women are deemed to be persons, right? That's positive. But you can also have the chance of disrespectful, right? Or less deferential interactions, which might be appropriate for the famous 5, because it's worth saying the famous 5, although the Persons case is undoubtedly, if you don't mind me saying, a good thing, they were also, many of them were also vicious racists, eugenicists, and so on, right? Their own legacy is something worth contesting over. When you can interact with the statues, you can do that. On the right, similarly in Ottawa, that's Lester Pearson there. You can sit on Uncle Lester's lap, but that doesn't mean you have to sit on it being nice and treat him as a avuncular, right? You can give him, right? You can pinch his nose, you can, right? By being able to interact, you become part of the art. And you thus you also become part of the memorialization. By making memorials something that we can interact with, we can play out the contestation. They no longer have to hide the contestation as if the hegemonic dominant story of, say, Canadian national mythology is the only one and simply needs to be accepted, right? You can play with it. So if you have a memorial to John A. Macdonald, instead of being up on a plinth 8 feet above you, lording it over us, put him down and let us come eye to eye with him. In fact, let us throw paint at him sometimes and leave the paint on for a while, right? So that people's own contestation of him and his legacy can become part of the art, right? Part of the memorialization, that when we think about ourselves and our identity through the stories we tell about public memory, that can be part of the story, right? As David Olusoga said, the response isn't the defacing of history, it is history. We can participate in the making of it. All right, I am almost out of time. I'm actually keeping better time than I thought I would. I'm gonna leave it on this, and then we can talk if you guys want. Surveying everything we talked about, I wanted some takeaways, lessons from that Old Testament way of telling a national mythology, namely Israel's. Again, the key thing that I want you to remember is remembering well means doing things differently. So for the Israelites, remembering well that they were slaves in Egypt and that they were set free not by their own power or their own genius, not by military might, but by the mighty hand of the Lord, that they're to live differently. They're to liberate their slaves. They're not to overexploit the land. They're to return land, right? So if you read the Levitical laws, well, they're in Deuteronomy as well, about years of remission and jubilee and so on, right? The constant refrain is, remember, you're doing this because you were once slaves, and I don't want you to live like that anymore. In the case of Canada, I'm going to well, I don't think this is out on a limb. I just think this is just true. One way of living differently is to recognize that reconciliation with Indigenous people, which is a crucial necessity for us, means decolonization of our national mythology. We have to remember it differently. We can't keep telling the same story the way the John A. Macdonald statue from 125 years ago, or even the way, bless his heart, I love the song, Gordon Lightfoot told it in the 1960s. We can't keep telling the story the same way. We have to wrestle with the fact that that anti-colonial counter narrative that I presented is true, right? And so, however we're going to do public memory, if we're going to have statues of John A. Macdonald, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, we need to do it in a way that allows us and gives us the opportunity and facilitates and encourages us to remember things differently from how they were originally asserted to be. Reconciliation with Indigenous people means decolonizing our national mythology, insofar as we have one. I'm also going to suggest that remembering means modest memorials. One other thing when I was looking at the Book of Judges is they didn't set up a big statue. In fact, anytime in the Old Testament that you have a national leader setting up big statues, it's always viewed as a kind of idolatry. Joshua sets up 12 stones, right? Doesn't mark them, doesn't shape them into the image of a great and all-conquering, the new rising nation of Israel that will be a terror to its enemies, right? But in a modest way. I'd like to see our memorials modest. Not gone, but modest. So again, if we got John A., take him off the plinth. Let us come face to face with him. Make him human. Also means, as in the Old Testament, remembering well means remembering not just who we are, but whose we are. That sounds like a cliche, and it is, but it's important. When Israel is told to remember that they were once slaves and that they were liberated by God, they're in almost the same breath, it's repeated, this is not your land, Israel, this is mine. You are not your own, you are mine, God says, right? You don't have a license to just do what you want. You don't have a license to just make yourself whatever you want to be. You're not self-created, you're mine. Right? And finally, remembering well can sometimes even mean forgetting. That certain things are best, as it were, forgotten or removed, as it were, from the national memory. Not just recontextualized, but just taken out of our story. Remember what Amalek did to you. Cancel it. There's something to cancel culture. So cancel Amalek, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much, everybody, for your patience and so on. I'll stop sharing this screen.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was wonderful. And I have a handful of questions already in the chat, but while we make our way through these questions, I would encourage you, yeah, Kathleen is doing a little virtual clapping there. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thanks so much. So if you have a question as well, just feel free to send that to me via the chat function. Send it to me privately, and I'll work through them as best I can. There's a number of them already, and as we make our way through these, we may open it up to sort of live questions as well. The first question, Michael, if you're ready, is from Harry Kitts. He wonders, just on the theme of a politics of provocation, is it not necessary at times to undertake a politics of provocation in order to draw attention to an issue and an ignored narrative, and in order to create space for a politics of deliberation?
Short answer, yes, Harry, absolutely. Provocation is often a necessary step. Much depends on how it's done. The question is it a kind of provocation that could, in a meaningful sense, lead to the kind of engagement that could promote mutual understanding? This is something I struggle with a lot, because one of the problems with the politics of deliberation is that it can be highly exclusive. Only certain people are brought into deliberation, that deliberation has a high bar of entrance in terms of people's capabilities, and so on. And so it can be highly exclusive, whereas a politics of sort of provocative activism has a much lower bar to entry in many respects. And that's crucial. And I mean, this is a major, it's not just a theoretical problem, it's a practical problem about how we do politics and how we set up our institutions to make the bridges between those. My big concern is that in this argument about public memorials, we don't get much besides provocation and counter-provocation. That neither side, and I'm going to say especially this, the burden especially lies on the people with power already. So I'm looking at you, Jason Kenney. I'm sure he's on this call. The burden is on them to respond in ways that can lead to genuine deliberation, right? To take the provocation as meaningful, as contentful, as worth engaging and understanding, rather than just taking it a chance to score political points to galvanize your base, right? So the building of a bridge between provocation and deliberation is a complicated thing, but the burden for it primarily lies with those who already have institutional power. It's their job. I don't know if that answers the question well, but it's a huge question and I don't know all the answers.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Michael. The next question we have is from Kara, your former student, Kara Peacock.
Hi, Kara.
Recently student at King's.
Yeah.
So it's a long one, but I think it's worth reading in full. So I'm gonna read it out to you, and you can respond as you wish. So Kara writes, Mercedes Peters, a PhD student in history at UBC, commented that, quote, one of the first things you're taught when you're training to be a historian in Canada is that Canadians have a memory problem, end quote. So Kara goes on to ask, how can we ensure that Canadians are meaningfully informed when, she would argue, education is structured in a way that denies Indigenous peoples as agential beings? And she goes on, there's a few follow-up questions here. Do shared frameworks run the risk of favoring existing power structures? Furthermore, how do these deliberative approaches meaningfully account for the asymmetries of those narratives that count, quote unquote, count? Colonial narratives and violence operate in a multiplicity of structures. Is deliberation enough?
That's a great set of questions, Kara.
And you know what I'll do, Michael?
Yeah.
I'll actually copy and paste it and send it to you in the chat too.
That would be great. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is I can think of a lot of things that can and should be done. And it's absolutely right that sort of a politics of deliberation runs an enormous risk of simply reinscribing existing power structures. So the city doing what I suggested, which is to create a deliberative assembly, can run the risk, right? Even if it works, makes a good faith effort to make sure that the representation is fair and that facilitation of is alive and awake to the asymmetries of discursive power that are likely to be present there. There's a danger it just reinscribes that again, because it's so deeply that sort of the colonial structures really are built very, very deeply into things. On the other hand, I feel like it's a risk worth taking to some degree, because it's better than the colonial, the sort of the raw colonial structure we live with now, right? But it's absolutely right, and I don't have a great answer. There's a lot of people working on that now, but those are, you know, yeah. I honestly don't know for sure. Work on it, Kara. Write a dissertation and give me the answer, because I need to know. Genuinely, I'm not being sarcastic.
And if you are asking a question and you want to follow up, feel free to. Kara answers there. Feel free to ask a follow-up question too, either in the chat or turn your video on and ask in person as well. So now we have a current student, Joshua Pyers, who has a question as well, sort of about context, which is an interesting angle. So he says, he notes that a few of the examples that you gave were from nations where those who established the memorials have either removed themselves or been removed. So an example would be the British in India. And yet some of the other examples are where a settler community, like in Canada, remains here. And so how, I guess the question is, how does that change the conversation, right? So in Britain, you provide an example of a British citizen who was involved in the slave trade. Canada is very much the dynamic is between settler and indigenous communities of some of the examples you gave, and others there are, like in the British colonization of India, there's they're no longer there, and so there's a different relationship to the memorial. So how does that sort of change the conversation?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because what, you know, to a certain extent, what you're looking at is a distinction between, say, post-colonial societies, insofar as colonialism is ever post, right, and continuing settler colonial societies. That makes a difference. But wouldn't it be amazing if a settler colonial society allowed its own heroes and founders to be treated in the same way that the heroes and founders of the colonial society are treated? Again, Stalin in Lithuania and the masters of the British Raj in India. If speaking as a white guy here, right, as an inheritor of the legacy of John A. Macdonald, if we allowed John A. Macdonald, and symbolically by extension ourselves, to be treated in a similar way, I think that would be, this may sound excessive, I think that would be remarkably Christ-like. To be able to, right, in one sense, it's just symbolism, right? By doing that, it doesn't alter the fundamental structures of the society. But symbolism, I mean, one of my points here is that symbolism matters, because symbolism has to do with the way we tell ourselves, our stories about ourselves. And how we understand each other is going to meaningfully affect our policy and our politics, who we elect, what we expect people to do, what we refuse to imagine as a possibility, and what we imagine being possibilities. I would frankly love to see that. I think I want to hold it up, the post-colonial solutions, as it were, as potential ones for settler colonial societies. That's massively oversimplistic, but why not, right? I'm sure people can fill me in very strongly on why not, but wouldn't that be amazing if we did it, right? Stalin would never have allowed Stalin's statue to be treated like that. Wouldn't it be amazing if we allowed our own to be treated like that? I'd love it. Let it weather. Let the pigeons poop on it. Not because that's disrespectful, not because it's somehow erasing the history, but because it's saying we're going to recognize our past as not something always to be held on to, because our past is deeply broken, right? So anyway, let people throw paint on it and leave the paint on for a while. Anyway.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Joshua, for the question. Jesse Edgington has a question, and sort of about, it's sort of about a different form of remembering. So we've been talking about memorials as sort of the physical, the physicality of memorials, but there are also sort of rituals of remembering. And so he asked about the blanket exercise being an example of a living, fluid memorial. That's Jesse's language. And do you agree that it sort of falls in the same line as that sort of what sort of remembering is it? And do you think how does this become part of the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, part of public memory is also our public rituals. right? Is the things we go through. So what we do on Remembrance Day down at the cenotaph, that's a public ritual that engages and re-engages us in a particular story and asks us to find ourselves in it and to treat something as sacrosanct in some ways, and a certain narrative about it as sacrosanct. The blanket exercise is a great example of both a counter narrative and a narrative in its own right. So I don't know exactly how it is to be done. I'd be suspicious if the government told us all to engage in the blanket exercise. But I'd love to see people engage in the blanket exercise in a John A. Macdonald park. I think that would be very powerful. It's a great place to do it. And then to think about the degree, the things that the public rituals that we're a part of and that we join in on, are we going to buy it? Okay, tiny little example. Let's stop doing the national anthem at sports events. Please. Let's just stop it. Right? I think, like, if I were in government, I'd pass a law about it. Right? Because and especially if we're going to do the national anthem at sports events, let's keep the military out of it. Right? Almost out of respect for our military, to be honest. But right, that's again part of the ritual that we almost don't recognize as ritual. Right? I mean, one of the things about rituals is you almost don't notice you're doing them. And the way it reinforces a narrative and a certain self-understanding and a collective self-understanding, let's be conscious about it and resist and possibly change, right? And be critical about it. Foster new ones. I don't think that's not a full answer, but that's a really, that's a great question, because these things aren't static. I mean, it was one of the points, right? Is that statues, they seem to stand still, but they don't. And they seem to send the message that history and ourselves stand still.
Well, and one interesting dynamic in relation to the blanket exercise that that was brought up by one of your colleagues is that it's really for white communities, for settler communities, and so what sort of rituals are not structured in that way, that that are really for communities to recognize their own privilege and to deal with it. But
I mean, one of my challenges, I'm a settler too. It's not really.
Well, it made me wonder about things like Orange Shirt. When you're talking about remembering and living differently, I was thinking about Orange Shirt Day, the Indigenous Art Park in central Edmonton. That's relatively new, close to the Walter Dale Bridge, or Indigenous Peoples Days and things like that. And those are all more than just remembering. But I wonder how those things are helping us remember and what's
absolutely, to pay some attention to that and try to create civic space for it, right? There might be a role in government in, right, in terms of creating space. I'm very nervous about government mandating our rituals, but
Julia, I think that's a good point, even if you meant it to be private. So, just let me sort of read through it here in full again. Yeah, I don't know if you want to respond to that, Michael. You can read it in front of you too. But
all right, well, okay. Pointing out about curriculum changes, right? Another site of a great deal of provocation and counter-provocation, but it's in many respects, it's on the one hand symbolic politics, on the other hand it really matters. So paying attention to what we teach and how we teach it, right? Young people's memories are less fully formed, and if we want to attend to how we develop public memory, paying attention to how, right, we do it with young people makes a lot of difference. But it's also one of the sites where meaningful deliberative contestation could happen if we did it right. I'm not convinced that our history of writing provincial curricula is brilliant, but it could be done in a way where there's meaningful attempts at mutual understanding in order to create a kind of curriculum that is meaningfully representative. There's going to be winners and losers. Not everyone's going to like the outcome, but where we can do it better than making curriculum a political football, right? And the present government isn't the only one who has a role in that. But I don't have a huge amount of wisdom. It's far from my area of expertise. But yeah.
I wonder, when it comes to remembering, we're talking about memorials, and I wonder what sort of remembering and deliberation, the difference between a memorial and a museum, and what the relationship between memorials and museums is sort of similar to the relationship between memorials and history curriculum in some ways. But yeah, there's different sorts of remembering that need to happen.
That's right. Because you go to a museum deliberately, usually, museums have more of a chance to engage you with meaningful context and potentially contested, right? And to open up what they have there as potentially meaningfully contested. They don't always do it. They don't do it brilliantly a lot of the time, but they have the chance. You're engaged. One of the challenges, again, with, say, public memorial art, the memorials that are just sort of the furniture of our public spaces, monuments being one, names being another major one. Those are the two that I've focused on. Our reception of them is almost entirely passive, right? And therefore they have a harder time. So simply slapping another plaque on the statue of John A. Macdonald that acknowledges the role he played in the genocide of Indigenous peoples doesn't do it, right? Because the level of activity of our imbibing of his presence there is more than the vast majority of us, right? The overwhelming message, if you're in a park with his statue, is still he's our hero, right? Even if you slap something on there. Whereas in a museum, you've got more of a chance with your audience. They're notionally at least there to engage. But I'm not a museum studies person, but I can imagine lots of ways in which some of these kinds of concerns could be wrapped around. It's worth walking back through the Alberta history part of of our new, relatively new Royal Alberta Museum, and say, how's it doing on this score? What's the story it's telling about Alberta?
Yeah.
Pickup trucks, the oil, right? The 80s Oilers. Always makes me tear up a little bit every time the 80s Oilers and their video clips, but right? Just because it gets me, that actually might be a reason I should be nervous, right? If it hits me exactly where I get verklempt, maybe I should be nervous. But
Michael, I have an interesting question here from another one of your colleagues, Mark Sandel. He says,
Mark knows more about this than I do.
What about memorials? What about memorials which attempt to transcend the nation state or national narratives? Should we remember things from other times and other places? I wonder, even if we present contested versions of the national narrative, will we still endorse the nation state as the fundamental organizing principle of modern life?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I mean, I sort of chose to use national mythology as the framework here, and thus left the question of whether having a national mythology is a good thing at all. I think if you have nation states, you're going to have a national mythology to some degree or another. It goes with the territory, but as if it's something inevitable. There's something anachronistic about me calling the Old Testament stuff that I looked at a national mythology. Right, Israel's not a nation in that same sense, but okay. But memorials that contest that, absolutely. But it's easy also to. I'm trying to think of examples. In Ottawa, there was being built. Is it built? Any Ottawa people can tell me about the memorial to the victims of communism? How's that going? Right?
It's contested.
Yes, it's contested, right? And that's a memorial, right? Canada has never been a communist country, no, regardless of what some people think. We've never actually been successfully communist. It's a memorial to victims of an ideology and a regime that we've never had. That's an example potentially of that. Boy, we can do it in a ham-fisted way potentially. Does that transcend the nation state? No, it doesn't. It's almost an expression of Ukrainian nationalism to some degree. It needn't be, but some of the push from behind it. So honestly, Mark, another one of those questions I have to say, I don't know. I would love to see things that meaningfully contest our sense of ourselves as being primarily and first and foremost members of the nation states, right? Like that element of national mythology, I would love to see that contested. One thing to do is let's, insofar as we're, the church should be very, very careful about reinscribing the national mythology within the church. Please, no flags in church, right? I'm even, I can see the impulse behind it, but I'm nervous about churches with plaques to fallen soldiers. I'm not against plaques to fallen soldiers. There's some incredibly moving and brilliant public memorials to fallen soldiers, not in church, right? And I mean, that's again one of the reasons I'd love to see it get out, the national anthems get out of sports, right? Fewer places where the national mythology as our fundamental primary story and therefore identity, the fewer places that's inflicted on us, the happier I am to some degree.
It's interesting. You brought up the nations or the people of Israel, and I was just in my first year theology class, we were talking about why in Genesis God is remembered as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but Joseph is not included in that narrative. But Joseph takes up a lot of the story of the book of Genesis, and some biblical scholars think that it's in part because Israel remembers the good of Joseph, but also remembers that Joseph basically built the economic system that eventually enslaved them. And it's a bit of a slight to him. So,
that's interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
I have a couple of questions here, and this is probably the questions we have time for before we sign off. So, one from Kalela, and my apologies if I'm not saying your name correctly. In regards to Michael commenting on the Royal Alberta Museum, the new Human History Gallery is half taken up with Indigenous people, both pre and post contact. Very little space is given to national resources or politicians or sports or the arts. So I guess relatively so at the very end of that part of the museum. Wondering, I guess another sort of comment on how that story of Alberta is told in the new Royal Alberta Museum, which is an interesting one.
I mean, one of the meaningful changes is that the old RAM used to have its Indigenous peoples exhibit over there, and then the history stuff elsewhere, right? And that gave the message, as it were, implicitly, that Indigenous history is not Alberta history, right? That Alberta history is this other stuff. And so the new setup, that's an improvement, right? Is that you start moving through that gallery, right?
Sort of, and brings like
with Indigenous
technology back. Yeah. And then Abby has a question. Abby Hofstede, another former student. Nice to see you there, Abby. I have a follow-up question for Dr. DeMoo from one of the things that was mentioned earlier in the lecture. You've mentioned that we need to build bridges between provocative politics and deliberative politics. It seems like provocative politics is the only thing that can, quote, get things done. So for example, lobby groups tried for years to get the statue in Bristol moved, all to no avail. In a system that seems to recognize only the provocative, what might building bridges look like? How can we begin to do this? You mentioned that the onus here is on people with institutional power to create sort of deliberative spaces, but I guess how can this process occur when they benefit politically from the provocative model? So, and maybe a similar question is just sort of how can people without power create space for deliberative politics?
One way is doing it themselves, right? If you're organizing a movement, you don't have to have that power, right? Create a counter-public, right? The public isn't just one thing that's presided over by the powers that be, right? There's a lot of potential public spaces. So even people who don't have power, insofar as they organize themselves, can do it differently, right? That's an almost glib answer, and it's too simple, but it is important to remember that the public and public spaces, I was largely talking about public spaces here as almost literally public land, parks and stuff, and sort of the built architecture of our cities and stuff. But in the sense of the dynamic sense of public in politics, there's multiple publics and they're potentially overlapping. And power is distributed differently in those. And between them as well. And so part of it is to do meaningfully deliberative politics, even if the powers that be won't, right? So when churches make public statements and when they do it well, that's one of the things they do. They don't always do it well, right? But they can be that, right? But drawing it's an absolutely enormous question that I have no single good answer to, and probably no complex good answers to. It occupies, when I have time to think about such things, an enormous amount of my thinking. But to understand that the public sphere is plural. There's a lot of publics, and they mutually intersect in complex ways. And there are some people who have no power in any of those, but fairly few people who have no power in any of them. And even those of us here, right? No premiers or prime ministers here. We have one former MLA. Hi, Annie, it's good to see you. Right, but right, Kings is a public, and I have institutional power there, right? I probably don't do it well. I do not want my colleagues to pipe up, but we can do it here in this public, and that public intersects with other publics and can have a transformative effect there. The church, right, and our churches, and the relationship between our churches and another public. And as so far as those churches intersect with a whole welter of community organizations. We have people here who are engaged with, like Jonathan worked, you worked at the Mustard Seed and so on, right? Insofar as we intersect and interpenetrate there, right? We can do things differently, right? We're still subject to the rules of power in the broader society to an extent that is hard to avoid. And we're also awfully fallen, and the more power we have even within our communities, the more incentive we have not to give it up. But it's not impossible. I don't know if that half answered your question, Abby, but that's the best step I can make at this point, because overwhelmingly of all the stuff that I talked about, that's the biggest, hardest question for me. It's like, I'm not satisfied when we contest about public memorials to simply have a politics of provocation and counter-provocation. I just don't think it's good. It certainly serves a lot of interest, and it certainly serves the interest of the powerful more than it does the not. On the other hand, to people who don't have power, it gives a political tool that's within their grasp, right? You can pull down a statue. You don't have to win an election to do it, right? And yet it's just not satisfying to just leave it at that. And then sometimes this flares up and everyone gets mad, and other times it's not flaring up and we just ignore it. That doesn't lead anywhere meaningful or helpful either. So what I'm trying to do is imagine accomplishable steps in the direction of a better way.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks for that question, Abby. It's nice to see you. And I'm going to turn things over to Kathleen to have a few final words for us. Thanks again, Michael. Maybe you can't hear all of our clapping, but thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I really like the one phrase that you had, remembering well means living differently. And maybe that'll be my takeaway. I was in the MB Church for a long time, and MCC has a little button for Remembrance Day. To remember is to work for peace.
Mm-hmm.
I always wondered about that statement, but you helped flesh that out a little bit for me tonight. So thank you for that. And want to thank all the Micah Center and all of our participants that have been part of our Justice series. To hear about biblical justice in Romans and learn about the pandemic and poverty, and tonight on toppling statues and severed heads and how to think differently or think at all for some about public memory. It's been really helpful, and I wish we could have had big breakout sessions for some discussion groups, but we will have these available, as Ashley said, on our YouTube channel. And you're welcome to contact profs if you have more questions, and we can try and facilitate some more dialogue on this. This has been really helpful in facilitating dialogue about these issues. So thank you. In November, we have a 5-part series that we are starting actually next week. And it's the Educating for Life series. And Dr. Humphreys and I did a 40th anniversary tour where we were able to visit several communities throughout BC and Alberta. And that's as far as we got as before the pandemic hit. But one of the things that we heard was that our alumni and our supporters and our churches are wanting Kings to provide professional development. They're wanting to hear from some of their professors that they learned from, and some of the ones that they hadn't been able to take in their time at King's. We want to highlight some of the thoughtful research and scholarliness of our professors and some of the dialogue that is going on in the classrooms for others who can't make it to King's. And we want to explore some relevant themes to educate, to dialogue, to help us wrestle with some of these big issues. And so that's part of why we're doing these public lectures. So next week we have our first in the series, and Dr. Melanie Humphreys is going to be leading it along with Harry Kitts, who'll be introducing her. And it's called Christian University Education in Times of the Pandemic. So we do encourage you to join us for that as Dr. Humphreys and Harry have a conversation about what it looks like for us at King's and what it looks like for the future. We have several other ones after that. And I know one of them that a lot of people are really interested in is Heather Loy's going to be doing something on sexuality and gender. And there's big conversations going on in our churches and in our schools about sexuality and gender. So Dr. Loy is going to try and bring some of the research and provide some hopefully helpful dialogue for you to consider. And we don't expect everyone to agree with everything that we say, but the point is that we are starting and continuing dialogue. And we want to have places where we can have healthy dialogue about many of these things. So this is one way we're able to start some of those conversations. So thank you for joining us for tonight. And for some of you, I know you've been part of this whole series that we've done on justice. And we hope to see you back next week as we start educating for the Educating for Life series. Thank you again, Dr. DeMoo and Jonathan, for your presentation tonight. Good.